Hello, everybody. It's Mick Levinskas here from Climate Salad. I almost said she's building a robot, which says it's. That was my last bunch of meetings I was doing last year. Now I'm with Climate Salad, which I'm very excited about. And today we're chatting to Daniel, who I have been very lucky to meet over the last 6 months through the climate tech networks globally. And Daniel's been amazing at tracking and meeting a whole bunch of climate tech companies, really supportive in the companies I've been sending to him, and we've been collaborating a little bit there. And I was convinced him to jump on the phone and chat to a couple of Australian climate tech activists, and hopefully share some stories and help build this industry to solve some of these big problems. So Daniel, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mick. Really excited to be here from California, talking to all of you lovely people over in Australia.
So Daniel, and really briefly, how are things over in California? It's the longest time in my life that I haven't visited, over 18 months. Nicely though, I was doing a carbon footprint yesterday, and it was like, how many international flights have you done in the last 12 months? And I was like, well, none. How are things over there?
Well, there's finally no more smoke, so I'll take that as a win.
Yeah, gosh, yeah, that's a big challenge in terms of bushfires, both California and Australia. When I moved from San Francisco to back to Sydney, basically it was going from bushfires to bushfires. Unfortunately, a state of play these days. But yes, I'm glad the smoke is clearing. I think we've got a reasonably full audience here, and to recap to everyone again, Daniel and I are going to have a chat, and then if you have an urgent question relating to what we're chatting about, please feel free to use the raise your hand function, and we'll jump you in for a question. Otherwise, we'll to get into some of the deeper stuff, we will cover that soon. But Daniel, be great to get a quick introduction from you about who you are, what you're working on, and why you're passionate about climate technology.
Yeah, best way to put it, I've got a day job working with a national lab today doing product management, but last 3 years just trying to explore the climate investment and innovation space. Volunteer with a couple of different organizations, from VCs, incubators, accelerators, even hosting events like through Techstars. And then when the pandemic started, shifted and started a couple of different newsletters, and really trying to connect with startups to help them succeed and have climate impact. And, climate has been something that's always been of interest to me. And at this point, I would say what drives me is, if we don't solve this climate problem, I would say nothing else really matters.
So you mentioned you've been doing this for 3 years, and what I found really interesting talking to you was that you do have a day job, but you're passionate about this, but you've really been making an impact as a connector. And if you don't subscribe to Daniel's newsletters, I highly encourage it. He's got a great Airtable set up where he sends the new companies he meets and what they've been working on, and he's really responsive. Thanks for putting that link in there. Read the impact. Really responsive in terms of the companies, and we've been he was sharing the companies that are interested in Australia, and I was sharing the companies interested in California. But what I'd love to really hear from you, Daniel, is over those 3 years, there's been just a massive shift in the industry as a whole, and I think there's a lot of people on here who may have been doing this for even longer. Can you give us a sense of whether like what was driving that? Is it philanthropy and the care? Is it the dollars? Is it just the latest game? And what does it mean now that actually the industry has changed so much?
Yeah, well, 3 years ago, I started working with Powerhouse Ventures, pre-seed and seed stage clean tech fund, and everything was new to me. And the sense I had back in 2018 was the terminology of clean tech was still being used. Fast forward to, I think, really 2020, last year, that's when the term climate technology started being used a little bit more. And I think the realization there was clean tech, at least for me, has the connotation of more of relating to energy and trying to have clean energy and looking at, energy is only part of the problem. So I would say climate says, yes, energy is part of it, but there's also carbon in the air. There's also circular economy. There's resource optimization. There are so many different pieces that have a factor. And I'm sorry, Mick. I think there was a second part of your question.
So there's obviously we've changed to the thinking about climate tech now, but also there's been a drive of capital into this space. And I'm really interested. One of the big discussions we have is there's capital coming in at the very high level. There's lots of companies coming through. There are some customers, but like if we think about this in terms of the difference between the first .com boom and bust, and if we think about the difference between say 2010, where SaaS was taking off and there was e-commerce and everything was growing because there was lots of customers. Was cleantech 1.0 like the first crash, and we are now in the second one where there's lots of customers? Or do you think there is still a triangulation that needs to happen between the companies doing stuff, the capital, and the customers?
I mean, I would say that there still needs to be a little bit more work being done. I think at the end of the day, policy will have a huge impact on getting that last everything over the edge. However, there are a lot more companies today that are paying attention to carbon footprint, net zero, and investors who are trying to get into the space. But I've connected with 300 plus investors, 300 plus startups. And at the end of the day, if we want to really look at carbon offsets, for instance, we have a ton of demand, but not enough supply. And what can really put that over the edge is if we incentivize the creation of new carbon offsets. So I think it's a bit of a yes to both of the questions of, yes, there's still triangulation, but there's also a lot of people moving into the sector.
Yeah. And how do you contrast? You mentioned climate tech is an expansion from purely energy of clean tech. In terms of the different areas, is your view that we need to explore all of them? We need to go really broad? Or is it, what if we solve food and energy, that's most of the problem? And also as a part of that, I'm interested in like technology bases. Comment someone said yesterday in another session was SaaS can't solve all of our problems, but between SaaS and nuclear fusion, there's a pretty big spectrum. So yeah, keen to know your feeling on the spread and focus of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, Project Drawdown is a great basis to look at what are the top contributors, but at the end of the day, I would argue everything counts. I was talking with Fifth Wall earlier today, and they were saying the real estate market accounts for 40% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. That said, there's also food waste that accounts for like a third of all food gets wasted, and that turns into methane, which is much worse than CO2. So I think there is a priority of which pieces are higher priority than others.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I would argue we need to be looking at food and ag, built environment, like restoring the ocean ecosystem, to essentially make the world more sustainable again.
Yeah, that's a pretty generic statement, but I do get to that as well. So in terms of the companies you're seeing come through, we're going to announce next week the Australia New Zealand top 50 climate tech companies. So check our email newsletter coming out soon. If Charlotte and I can work out the bugs in our email, but we're going to announce that map, and we want to show a really broad array of companies. In terms of what you still see through in that kind of deal flow, are you seeing fairly balanced coverage across all those different areas, or more focus on some and we need to do more work in others?
Um, I mean, I'm all over the place when it comes to innovation in the space. Um, I would say that there are some, every so often I'll see some trends. For instance, there were a couple months earlier this year where I just saw imagery, satellite imagery meets food and ag. And I saw who knows how many of these startups. And I just said, this is no longer like, yes, this is a trend. There's no way to figure out who the winner is, but there's a lot of focus on this problem, which is good. I would argue at the end of the day, and this might be just more of the chemical engineer in me, hardware solutions are going to do move the needle a lot more than software solutions. We still need software to help solve the optimization problem. But at the end of the day, I would argue we don't need 20 or 30 different food and ag satellite imagery companies or 20 or 30 different carbon offset marketplaces.
Yeah, tough to get that differentiation. Something I find about this industry, which is different to the tech boom, is the role that incumbents are playing. You've seen some of these companies come through and get strategic investment. Like, what's your view on that industry pressure on the industry? Like, sorry, yeah, for the force on the industry. Are you seeing that as a positive, and we've got to bring them along with us, or we need to disrupt them, get out of the way?
I mean, I think it's a bit of both. I think disruption will give incumbents a wake-up call. At the same time, I think partnering is also very smart. I mean, time and time again, I look at corporate VC models, and I think that it's a great structure because that gives flexibility in terms of resources, capital, partnerships, customers. So then startups can strategically grow within an industry. I think one corporate VC that apparently no one really knows much about is with the Heritage Group. They have HG Ventures, and they span all over the place with chemicals. And they actually partner with Techstars for an accelerator program. So there's going to be a combination of some incumbents that embrace it and say, let's find these technologies, and others that will need the disruption to actually move.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. I think that's a dynamic which I think is still being worked out, because I think partnering early can really hurt a startup because they lose access to the customer feedback loop. But some of these things have got to get to scale, and some of them are really hard. If you look at, and as you said, the hardware side of things, anything to do with energy distribution, there's going to be a lot of lessons to learn from these bigger companies. So yeah, I think it's not, there's no single answer to that, but I think it's it's really interesting to see that dynamic playing out. And just on that, in terms of the global dynamic, obviously you're based there in North America. Like, what's your sense of international market forces, collaboration, and in particular, obviously with Australia? Is it is yours? Like, how do your North American companies and North American, I guess, investors look at the Australian market?
So the startups I usually talk to are between pre-seed and Series A. So usually just about getting ready for entering market and scaling. I would say at the Series A stage, maybe Series B, that's when they are getting really situated with where they are based. I talk with startups globally. Easier to reach markets are the America and Europe, and Australia, thanks to you and a few others. I think startups should definitely be exploring routes to, or starting to grow and scale in other countries, because I think there's definitely more opportunity, especially if we talk about hardware-based hardware startups that have a manufacturing facility. If you can bring technology to a different market, you can produce it probably a little bit cheaper. You can create jobs as well and have, in theory, a triple bottom line of financial returns, environmental returns, and like social returns. So it's something that I actually don't think enough startups really do think about at the earlier stages.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I think certainly the last 15 years, most of my work in the US was 99% US focused. It seems like obviously climate is a global problem. So there's no point just solving it for an individual country, but also going global immediately.
And on that note, if you capture 1 ton of carbon in the US, it's all part of the atmosphere. It does it for the whole world. So
true.
There's that part as well that just blows my mind. Of some people are just very focused in one area, which is fine. But when you think about economics of, well, if you can deploy something in Africa for a little bit cheaper, it still has the same environmental impact.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's I think especially given the cost of capital requirements of some of these companies, the fact that maybe if there are local market benefits of being somewhere else, whether it's access to raw materials, access to the right labor, or supply chain. Obviously, if it's moving electrification, electricity around, like a big sun cable up to Asia from Australia, that obviously needs distribution. But as you said, sequestration, the Climeworks based in Iceland, great, do it in Iceland, put it in the ground, create some quartz there, and it helps the whole world. So it's interesting. There are local impacts in terms of flooding and fires and urban heat islands, but then that is actually caused by a global problem, especially with oceans and air. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I hadn't thought about it that way. Can you talk? I know you see a lot of companies coming through. Is there anything really different you've seen someone taking? Because I kind of feel like we're at the front edge of the disruption where, 5 years from now, we'll look back and there'll be some really different things which you didn't expect. Like there's some obvious ones like carbon offsetting, as you said, and do better with plastics. There's things that are kind of like 1 degree away from the problem. But are you seeing any really crazy innovations coming through that, because you've seen a lot over the last 3 years? What's really turned your head recently?
Yeah, there was one startup earlier today I was talking with, Haystack Ag, where they are, I've seen this gap of carbon offset verification, and how do you make that process a lot easier, a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper. They are helping essentially verify soil offsets, which I think is great, and that's going to be a huge piece in terms of regenerative agriculture. That's really the first of its kind that I've seen there. The other trends that I've seen and have been impressed with have been, I would say, process improvements for manufacturing or production, whether it's chemicals, materials, anything that can be a drop-in replacement or addition to a process that reduces energy costs, water usage, or even just production time, I think is going to be huge. And in theory, that area is endless. One startup, Silvatex, they are focusing right now on the cathode materials for batteries, and they are reducing energy by 40% and water usage by, I think they said 70%, which is ridiculous. And I look at that and I say that's no brainer, and that's not even like their biggest market to start off with, but it's just one that they have routes into, like working with OEMs.
Yeah. I want to dig into that a little bit as well. I have seen a few things like Haystack. We've got Soil Carbon Co in Australia, which is doing things around microorganisms, but it feels like even there is no fully understood concept of the currency of carbon yet. Not what it's understood, but it's not actually it's not clear in the market, right? There's still things to be worked out, including what is the value of soil, what's the value of a tree, what's the value of pulling out a ton of carbon from the air, and it's really seems like we're working hard because of the imperative of the problem, but we still haven't got some of those things worked out. And obviously, as you said, there's 20 companies doing each of these things. They're not all going to win, and they're probably some are probably overstating, some are understating the potential benefits. But what's your sense in terms of timing again? There was a good post the other day about a lot of these companies need to survive long enough until regulation and the market catches up to them, and that these things like the currency of carbon actually gets to be fully built into the framework. Is that how you see it as well? Is that people have to these companies will have to be find a way to survive until the rest of the market pieces come together and support it, or do you see some of them just have? Do you think we're already there?
There's definitely a ways to come. I think startups are, just because there's a lot of capital moving into climate, that startups will inherently be able to survive long enough to see. I mean, ideally, I would love to see a carbon tax come into play. I think that's one way to really.
Do you think it will?
I have no clue to answer that question.
Yeah, we had one for about 3 years or something, and then they got rid of it. But and I think Australia would have been massively ahead if we had kept it. But anyway, that's another story, another podcast.
Yeah, so I think a carbon tax can really buy the fire under people. I would argue when we talk about survival, I think we're talking about early stage technologies, which I think early stage technologies are more of like a 2050 solution than a 2030 solution. So when I think that, I say we should be focusing on 2030 solutions first, because if we can't make it to 2030, why are we investing in? I don't know, like the next fusion. I don't know what it is, but sure. It's taken, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years. And Lawrence Livermore Lab, where I work, they just recently managed to do something within like not even like half a second, like milliseconds, nanoseconds of fusion.
Yep.
And that's just to get it to happen. That's not even to commercialize it.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I think the 2030 versus 2050. There was the Rethink X team with Tony Seba did that thing and said, hey, let's stop innovating on all these other things. Let's just go really hard on solar, batteries, and wind. Go food, like cultured food, and EVs and automated vehicles. That's all we need to do. That'll get 90% of the way, and that's the focus. And I think if you my view is, I look at that and it's like it's easier said than done. And actually, food is a lot further away than wind and solar, and even batteries. But if in terms of the things that to focus on to get done now, because we have to get things sorted. So in terms of the investment, like a lot of things you're seeing are very early. Are you really pushing hard for things that actually are materially in place and scaled by 2025 so they can have a 2030 impact? And you leave the rest to research?
I mean, one contrarian idea I have today is I've talked to, I don't know, at least 20 different people who are starting smaller size funds. And I would say, that's great, that we're looking at pre-seed, seed stage investments. I would argue if we just pulled all that together and created a, debt financing or venture debt fund or something that can help with actually project finance and setting up facilities, that would do a lot. That would have a lot more impact on the time scale that we need.
Right. Yeah,
I
interesting.
think that's just the best way to put it, of investment on the time scale.
Yeah. Do you think that is not happening currently because there's still risk, or it's just we're not factoring in the right economics?
I think it's a bit of both. I think I don't think investors at Series B, Series C stage know how to really assess and underwrite risk. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second part you mentioned?
Yeah, basically, why is that happening? Why isn't somebody doing it? And is it, as you said, that I think a lot of people are venture people, they don't know how to do the debt side. So why at the debt side? We're seeing in Australia with companies like Bright, which are doing financing for sustainability, but it's kind of more fintech than it is climate tech, which is maybe okay because it's getting more solar and more batteries put on. But what you're talking about is much bigger scale, is how do you do funding of big wind farms and big solar farms and mass, regional battery installations, etc. So yeah, I don't know what moves the needle there. I guess there's more excitement about venture because it's you got a cool logo and a name, and you're but as you said, they typically take 5 to 6 years to get to anywhere near scale, especially if you're talking hardware tech.
Oh, right. The other piece that you mentioned was the commercialization and unit economics.
Yeah.
I think I'm not sure exactly if that's something startups think about when they are first in like the R&D phases. Usually they start thinking about it after they de-risk the science, when they start thinking about de-risking the engineering, which when we're talking about hardware, I mean, that could be at the seed stage. I've seen Series A, Series B, like financing rounds that are larger, and they, they haven't built a facility yet.
Yeah. So that goes on to another question I have around the capital requirements. They look like a lot of these companies have massive capital requirements, but it's coming at a time when there is pretty cheap capital around, and every raise. I think we just saw an $11 million seed round in Australia, and we're seeing $20 million A's and things. So it doesn't seem like the amount of capital is the issue. Like this, there are these massive infrastructure projects which need a lot of money, but there seems to be money out there. So that shouldn't be the blocker. Are you seeing the same thing? You're seeing that there's actually a lot of capital and these rounds are getting bigger and bigger?
Yeah. I mean, I think valuations are getting higher, and as a result, the amount of investment is also a bit higher as well. I think that's just the nature of a lot of capital moving into the space. Valuations will get higher and the cost of capital will, in theory, get cheaper, which I think can stand to benefit the startups. On the investment side, that means you have to start thinking about what can your capital give the startup access to that others can't.
Yeah, and that's another interesting thing around this space is there's not many people, even the clean tech investors, with a lot of them left the space. There's a few like Aviocall who's still around, and obviously Powerhouse, Emily and the team there have been doing that for a while. But actually, credibility as a climate tech investor, considering the category was only really created less than 2 years ago, there's not a lot of depth. There's not a lot of depth of experience. Do you think that matters for the investors in terms of like what do they bring, or can it also be other things like customer access and running the business capital raising?
I would say that probably does not matter as much as because in theory, the startup should understand the technical pieces and be able to focus on that science and engineering. I would say the benefit of having investors is helping out with the business side. And on that business side, I think, what an investor can offer is endless, from growing and scaling a company to access to customers to subject matter experts, whatever it is really on that side.
Okay. And for you personally, like what gets you excited about climate tech and the companies you're seeing now?
Just in general?
Yeah, like what are the things that you're trying to dive into now as particular areas? So there's a lot of breadth. You mentioned using satellite image for ag. Is there a particular area of climate tech right now that you're like, this is something that we need to help more in, and that you feel like you can have that kind of impact?
Yeah, I mean, the two areas I mentioned previously of looking at how to lubricate the carbon offset process, I think is one piece, followed by manufacturing and production improvements. I'm an engineer fascinated with finance, so I actually have found myself digging into the financial side, and how to assess risk. And then there is one other area. It'll come to me.
What's your thoughts in terms of DK's asked a question around on the fintech side and carbon credits? Like there seems to be, and you mentioned the people working on the measurement of that, and I see at least once a week someone trying to do blockchain around carbon credits. Like, what's your sense of that as a? Do you think that's like there's going to be a one big winner? Is it going to be really fragmented? Is that something we've got to sort out soon to get to 2030 value?
I do think it's fragmented. I do think it's something that we need to figure out to look at 2030 goals, because it kind of gets back to, you still need carbon offsets. Yeah, it's definitely a space that, I think I've seen some startups in this space, like a little bit more on transactions and ledgers where blockchain meets climate. To be honest, it goes a little bit over my head there. Yeah,
but it's hard to imagine who's at the center of that, right? I think it kind of has to get momentum and get to some scale before people get on board with it. Otherwise, who do you trust to actually be the minute? Like, you've got to kind of open source it, let it go. It makes it tough for a business model unless you're just buying some early credits. But and I don't think anyone would trust an oil and gas company to run it. Doesn't really quite suit a role for government. Google and Amazon would love to do it, but doesn't really make sense. Banks and finance companies doesn't make sense either. It's hard to know who sits at the center of it.
My thought on the customers of who would be buying the carbon credits should be small and medium-sized businesses versus the Amazons and Microsofts, who can actually make the changes necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
So small and medium businesses, obviously super fragmented, and they're often working hard just to keep their heads above water. Look, what's going to drive that kind of behavior? Is it going to be regulation, or is it going to be consumers telling them, I'll take my business elsewhere if you can't tell me you're sustainable?
I think at the end of the day, it's going to be policy, because that will take care of consumer behavior, that will take care of business behavior.
And do you think policy is going to lead, or is consumers going to drive it enough to then make policy change because of votes?
You know, I think that's the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would like to imagine, you know, either could happen. If I had to place my bets, I think it's going to have to come from policy first.
Okay. Do you think it's one big step or it's going to be staged?
I mean, I think it's, I don't know. I mean, I live in California where we had a plastic bag ban. New York has a plastic bag ban. Where some states will just naturally say, we are going to do this. And, you know, then the federal government may or may not follow.
Yeah. Okay. A good question from Andrew Rogers. Who are the leading angel investors in the US on climate tech? Who's the, let's say, Jason Calacanis of climate?
You know, that's a good question. Who do I follow? I guess within the US, there's Sandeep Ahuja of Climate Capital, who I would say he's pretty well known in the space. He has a couple syndicates on Angel List. I don't know who else. Angel investors. That's one world where, you know, it's easy for me to find institutional VCs to connect with. Finding angels is a little bit harder. I'd love to connect with more angels.
Wait, Chris Sacker and Lower Carbon Capital. Do you think is he being it looks like he's being active, but have you seen any? He seems quite big. He's got a pretty big checkbook.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Chris Sacker from Lower Carbon Capital. Yeah, they made a big splash, a lot of noise, and he swears a lot. But he's you know, who's writing the really small checks and getting these companies started?
I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's a lot of players in the space. I don't think I could point to just one person and say it's like, I can't say, you know, it's just Sandeep. There are lots of players. I mean, you know, My Climate Journey, Jason Jacobs, you know, with a rolling fund. I don't know if you consider him and that model like an angel. I mean, Angels back his syndicate. I think that's another one to watch. One that recently came out, was it Cool Climate Collective, Tristan Pollock. I think that one will be interesting to watch as well, just because his background is a little bit more in tech originally. I know Tristan. I've known him for years, and I'm looking at that syndicate. So already got some interesting companies coming through. I saw insect protein for pet food, which I think is a great idea. But it goes to, I guess, one of the big questions is Middle America. Do they care about climate tech? And I guess that's maybe goes back to the policy question. You know, what's going to drive them to switch to sustainable pet food for their animals, and buy hamburgers, you know, buy plant-based hamburgers, unlikely to be their carer of the environment, right? So that's going to be policy driving that all that change. Are there any? I know you've got great content you put out as well. Is there any other podcasts or communities you would suggest that people listening might jump into? Yeah, on the community side, I mean, My Climate Journey, I think, has been great. There is New Energy Nexus. Work on Climate is another one. I've joined climateaction.tech. And then over in Europe, there's Green Tech Alliance and Rising Tide. Those are probably like the top 5-ish I'm a part of that. I think there's a lot of good content there. In terms of podcasts, there are so many out there at this point. I don't know. I mean, this could be a plug for me to say, with the impact, we're starting to do some podcasts with startups. I would argue also newsletters, like what I'm working on with Innovate Climate, of physically connecting people together is like an unofficial community that at the end of the day is really saying, let's connect people together, rather than, I think some of that communities people join, and it's great to be part of it and have resources. Sometimes that just does not lead to action, though, I would say.
Yeah. And so in terms of connecting with you, obviously they can subscribe. If people are building climate tech companies in Australia, are you interested in chatting to them if they're still early stage? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, everyone can reach out. I think it's through the Airtable they can apply, fill out the form and put those details in. So that's great.
Or you can always reach me on LinkedIn. You're welcome to share my email, Mick.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. For startups, I can drop that link here in the chat, which I have a short intake form, and then I just say, here's my Calendly, find the time.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we first connected, so that's great. So Daniel, any last messages you have with people? Let's say there's some people listening or watching this video who thinking about starting a climate tech company, not quite sure if it's an industry which is like worth the 10 years of hard work. Any message you put for budding entrepreneurs?
Find a gap that, find something that is more on the infrastructure side or on the technology side. I think there are lots of technologies or IP that are with national labs or universities that could easily be picked up and used. And I think that could be, that's one easy way to just go and see, what's out there without, spending years pursuing a PhD.
I'm
all about work smarter, not harder.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll see if there's any more last questions from the group. But a question for me that relates to that: Australia hasn't been great traditionally at converting researchers and scientists into entrepreneurs. Not as successful as California and Israel and others. Is there is that something that we need to really do, or is it actually a combination of entrepreneurs and the scientists, engineers that's going to have the biggest impact?
I think as long as there are resources available, be it incubators, accelerators, angel investors, I think it's the people who get involved at the earliest stages that can really help.
Okay, awesome. Andrew, did you have a follow-on question from some of your questions in there?
Yeah, just you got San Fran and Seattle and places, big centers for the tech startups for a long time. Is climate tech coming out of those same places, or are there other geographies in the US that it's concentrated around?
Yeah, within the US, I would say where I've seen innovation hubs, other than San Francisco Bay Area, Houston, Texas, we're oil and gas country. Boston, I think Boston does have a little bit more on the synthetic biospace, although there's also indie bio in San Francisco. I know Chicago, they've been a little bit more focused on the energy sector, energy and grid. I think it just depends. If we talk about food and agriculture, that could be California. And I've talked to companies that are based, in the Midwest, in the middle of the US, flyover states. National labs are good hubs as well. So like Idaho National Lab, Oak Ridge. I think it depends on what's in each geographic region.
Do you think, Daniel, further to Andrew's question, there's likely to be low geographies that actually specialize in particular areas, and So, ag might come from a particular area and batteries and energy from others.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what I've seen with like Boston has been a little bit more in the synthetic biospace, for instance. And then I think it's more of focus is just based off of where the geographies are rather than certain geography areas being experts in the space.
Yep. Chris has asked a question about lithium sulfur battery technologies. Any thoughts on that space?
I think I just saw a deck cross my email with sulfur batteries. My general outlook on batteries and materials is we need to shift away from lithium because it's a scarce resource and the recovery process is not quite there. Plus, we're also throwing away batteries that, they still work. They are just less efficient. So there's the recycling portion as well. Let me see if I can find that sulfur battery company really quickly.
Thanks. Yeah, no problems. Again, Daniel's got a lot of that information available onto his websites and the different companies. As Chris mentioned, there's changes every day, and there's activity happening in batteries, certainly in sulfur batteries very recently. But I agree on the lithium side, Australia's certainly got some precious minerals and some assets there. But it doesn't mean that we should be staying with those things. And I think we have to do some things as stopgap measures to get to better places, because not all of the best technologies are going to be there. I think that's my view, is that's kind of okay, but we can't get reliant on those yet either. So we're coming up to time. So Daniel, really appreciate your support of the Australian climate tech companies and the climate sailor community. Thanks for offering to speak to any of the companies here and reaching out. Plenty going on, and great to see, I think, the world being really well connected in this space. So for me and the team and everyone listening, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts, and also, again, definitely the opportunity to connect with you follow on. So thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mick.
No problems, mate.